a lot of times people ask, what does change management mean? And it's such a fuzzy word, it's a nebulous term. It doesn't mean a lot on its own, it's kind of pretty vague. But the way I would describe organizational change is anything that prepares people for business changes that are happening. And when I say business changes, they could be process changes, it could be technology changes, organizational restructuring, redesigning jobs, whatever the case may be. So anything that prepares people for the transformation and drives transformational performance. I think the focus and the pressure on people, or the focus on change management and the pressure on people that organizations experience is only going to accelerate, is going to continue to accelerate in the coming years, largely because technology is changing so fast. It feels like, it's a hockey stick almost, like with AI and everything happening now. Technology is just changing faster than it ever has, but organizations aren't changing faster than they ever have for the most part. I mean, they are speeding up, but they're not speeding up as much as technology is changing. And so that creates this sort of a tension with people because technology is changing so fast. We're over here sort of the way things are and have been as an organization, and meanwhile technology is just kind of, growing at a breakneck speed or changing at a breakneck speed. So the need to focus on people and driving performance is going to continue to be important, but it's going to be even more important, in my opinion, in coming years, especially with AI and some of the impacts that that's going to have on organizations and operations throughout the world. So one of the things that is worth noting is that change is difficult and personal. So a lot of times we get into these situations where executives will say, we don't need to worry that much about change management because our people are ready for the change. And you talk to people, you talk to a room like this, and you get a bunch of people saying, yeah, our technology sucks, tired of the old spreadsheets, I have to redo stuff all the time, I have to re-enter data. So on the surface, you think, okay, this organization's ready for change. These people are ready for change. The problem is once you start to peel back the onion, or the layers of the onion, to determine what the changes are and how it's going to impact people, that's where the resistance kicks in. One way to think about it is a lot of times people think change management or resistance to change is a negative thing, like people have ill will or that there's nefarious reasons for the pushback, and usually the pushback comes from a good place. It's because they've been valued in the organization for some time. They've built up a huge amount of tribal knowledge. They know how things work, and now you're ripping out the rug from beneath them, and that's where the resistance comes from. It's not because they're bad people. It's not because they want to see the project fail. They don't want to sabotage the project in general. There are some sabotage type people within any organization, but I'd say most of the time, 99% of the time, the resistance to change is coming from a good place. And the other thing too is change management is oftentimes viewed as a project. Let's get a change project in place. And yeah, you want to have milestones and timelines and accountability, all that stuff. You do want that, but change doesn't just happen as a project. It's not a big milestone where you declare victory. It's a constant journey. And so that's another way to think about change management too, especially when we talk about driving performance, like we talked about earlier today. When you're really trying to optimize ROI, drive performance, and get better business results, you're going to constantly be fine-tuning and improving the way you do things. So some of the common myths about OCM, one is that change management is just training and communications. And that's one of the more common myths with change management. And the reason this is so common, I think, is because back to what I said before, you can see and touch training and communications. I can measure how many hours of training I gave or how many people passed the competency test for a training. I can measure that. I can measure how many emails I sent out giving people an update on the project, or I can see the PowerPoint presentation that gives everyone an update on the project. So that stuff I can see and touch, but when you start talking about culture, alignment, change readiness, it's real fuzzy, at least in my mind. If I just hear those terms without any context or understanding what it is I need to do, then it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so what I want to do throughout this presentation is talk about how to add some tangible meaning to different dimensions of change and really open up outside the realm of training communications, which are both really important, but there's a lot of other things that are prerequisites to doing training and communications well. Second myth is that if you put in new technology, you're going to transform the business. You will not transform the business just by putting in technology. I've seen plenty of them that spent a lot of time and money with a beautifully designed system, but it didn't drive any real business value to the organization, either because people weren't using it the way it should be, or because the way it was designed and built wasn't done in a way that's going to actually improve the business in any meaningful way. So that's another common myth, is that just putting new technology in is going to drive transformation. And the way I look at it too is if you're going to spend however much money you're going to spend on new technology, why wouldn't you invest heavily in the thing that's going to make that technology initiative successful, which is the change management. There are times where we'll tell a client you should not be implementing new technology, because if you can't invest in change management and you're not going to do it right, why would you bother doing it? You're just going to waste a lot of time and money, and you're probably going to put your company at risk operationally if you don't do it well. And that's another big thing too, by the way, is change management has some real tangible, measurable business value, both positively and negatively. If you don't do change management well, it's really easy to measure the shipments you can't ship or the payroll that you can't run. So if you start to measure it and think of it that way, and think about what is my risk, then oftentimes a light bulb will go on, where people say, wow, I really should maybe think about investing in change management. I had one client, it was actually the first project that I managed when I started my last company, which was a Panorama Consulting. I started that company as well. And when the first project, because I was still doing project work at the time, and I was managing one of our mid-sized manufacturing clients, they went through an implementation, and they didn't want to extend the timeline like we had recommended, because they did a bunch of customization of the software and it wasn't fully tested yet. And the CEO got really tired. He's like, this is just too much, costing us too much money. We're gonna flip the switch and go live. And we told him it's a bad idea because we haven't finished the testing from a technical perspective, and we certainly hadn't gotten through the user acceptance testing. And he said, I'm done spending money on this project. Our people are tired. We want to move on, so we're gonna flip the switch. And we flipped the switch, and this is about $100 million manufacturing company, so not huge, but not tiny. And in the weeks after the go live, they lost over $10 million of orders. And when I say they lost them, it wasn't like, oops, we lost it, we just need to go enter it in the system, and we couldn't process it or whatever. It's no, the orders were canceled. There was $10 million of orders that were canceled by the customers because they couldn't ship the product in time. And so you look at that, and it was going to cost, just to put it in context too, it was going to cost them about $200,000 extra on the project for what we were recommending to get through the last round of testing, user acceptance testing. So there's your ROI right there. I'm not saying spending the $200,000 would have solved all the world's problems, but you probably wouldn't have spent anywhere near as much in getting it right as you would have in those lost orders. So I think that's one of the best ways to think about change management is how can we quantify it, in not only in terms of what we want to get out from optimization purposes, but also what's the risk of it if we don't do it right? What's that going to cost us? How big of a deal is it if we can't run payroll, or we can't ship product, or we can't close the books for a few months after go live? You just have to ask yourselves that, and then do kind of a risk-reward assessment there, and that will oftentimes lead you to more change management. And then the third common myth is that consultants manage change. They don't. I think we're really good at change management. I love change management. I think I'm pretty good at it, but I'm not gonna do change management well for anyone in this room. Not because I'm not capable, but because I alone cannot do it. My team alone cannot do it. They need the faces of the change to come from within the organization. We certainly provide the framework, the tools, the advisory behind it, but it has to be the organization that owns the change. You can't outsource the change effort. It needs to come from internally within the organization. I want to hit a few highlights here of just some of the tools and frameworks that can be used to manage change. I talked about assess organizational readiness. That's the thing I was just talking about a moment ago. So that's one tool. If there's one tool, I'd say every organization does want to start with this one thing. I would say it's assess the organizational readiness and measure it. Because once you do that, then all this other stuff starts to fall into place. And all this other stuff is sort of like a toolkit. You're going to have different intensity in each of these areas depending on your organization and the results from the organizational readiness. The other thing too is that different parts of your organization you might use different tools for different parts of your organization. Different departments or different locations, there might be more or less resistance that you anticipate in different parts of the organization. So these are some of the different tools you use. There's a lot here in terms of communication, mobilizing change agents, but I'll talk about the ones I think most important in addition to organizational readiness. Top right is change impacts. So really get into that job design and organizational design of the organization to define what people's jobs are going to look like in this new environment. That's really important because, again, just putting the systems in place alone isn't going to get it done. Just training people how to use the software alone isn't going to get it done. We have to define how people's jobs are going to look in the future. A good example now is we have a lot of clients asking about AI. So how are we going to leverage AI in this project, and what AI use cases can we define that we can test out within the organization. And AI, if you just give AI to an employee and say, hey, just go use this AI tool to make smarter decisions or to make the job easier, they're not going to know what to do with it necessarily. They might have some ideas, they might try some stuff out, do some trial and error, which is fine. But if you really want to scale that out to the entire organization, you need to define what is it we want, how is it we want to use AI in this example? What is it we're going to do with the AI tool? What is and isn't appropriate for us to put into an open AI model? Where's the low-hanging fruit of how we can make our jobs better and easier using AI? And let's define what that looks like and then roll it out to the organization and communicate it to people that are affected by it and help them understand the what and the how at a high level to start, and then you get into training later, and then you show them more detailed hands-on how to do it. So that's another important one. Defining and deploying process improvements is another underrated change activity. And it may sound simple enough, or you may think you're doing it on a project, but oftentimes you're not. What you're really doing is designing a new system that does things a little bit differently, but you haven't really defined what your end-to-end process is necessarily. Or at least you haven't laid it out for the organization to see, what the end-to-end process is. And ERP systems are so big too. They do so many different things that it's easy to design it in silos. You have different modules, different specialists for different modules from a technical perspective, and they start designing and building stuff. And now you've got, say 20 consultants that are designing and building different parts of the system, and no one oftentimes steps back to look at, well, how does this all tie together? How's this going to flow end to end, and does that make sense? The ERP systems, even cloud and SaaS solutions, are so flexible now compared to what they used to be. So there's a certain amount of clarity you have to have on what you want to be when you grow up before you start designing and building the software. And now that's not just a change issue, by the way. That's a project management issue. It's a realistic expectation issue. If you can define your end-to-end processes up front before, ideally, I think you'd mentioned, I apologize, I get the three presentations a bit mixed up, but I think you mentioned, you were talking about software selection and how ideally you want to do some of that process work up front. I totally agree with that. If you can do that process work ideally before you select the software, not only going to choose the better software option for you, but you're also going to have a better blueprint for how you deploy that software. A lot of times we think about the configurations on the critical path. If we can't get the configuration of the system done in the amount of time we thought, it's going to push everything out. If we don't manage the change and get people to change their behavior in a reasonable amount of time, that's what's going to take the time. That's going to take longer than deploying new technologies. The technology is always going to be able to be implemented faster than an organization can change. But one thing I'll leave you with is when you talk about process improvement and defining the future state business processes, that is a really important prerequisite to managing change well. Because if you don't have that clear vision of what the end-to-end processes are, and you haven't defined how you're going to improve your processes, you can't do a lot of the other stuff I talked about as it relates to change impacts and designing what the organization is going to look like to support those processes. Too often, change management teams have the right idea, but they're sort of chasing a moving target because they don't know what that vision is, or things are changing, and the organization is changing its mind about what they're going to be when they grow up. So we've got to figure out a way to make sure that we design those processes up front, not just to give us clarity from a project management and implementation perspective, but also so that we can manage the change and understand what the changes are and what the impacts are. And again, even if you may not, it's going to be premature to define step by step how someone's job's going to change because we haven't implemented the technology yet. We haven't even designed it yet. So it's unrealistic to say we're going to get to that granular level of detail at this point. But what we can do is say, back to that spreadsheet example, I think it's a great example for this, especially is we know that spreadsheet's going to go away and we're going to put in Plex, or whatever the ERP system is that's going to replace it. How is that going to affect those three people's jobs and everyone else who touches the MRP process? The people that are tracking inventory, for example, or people that are running reports, procurement people, how their jobs are going to change in some way. Let's start articulating what those changes are, at least at a high level, so that we can start managing that change. And then when we get down into the system design, that's where we get into more granularity to show them how and why things are changing. But at least we can start to manage and communicate some of those changes early on.